For 30 years, John has carried the ghost of his father, David, the man in the yellow vest who led the Oak Hill Neighborhood Watch. In 1985, his father and the entire six-man group vanished after their nightly patrol, leaving behind only a map on a park bench and a town's worth of unanswered questions. Now, a call from the city sanitation department changes everything. A routine sewer line inspection, the first in over 3 decades, has unearthed a relic from that cold night, a corroded flashlight lens, unmistakably his father's. It's incredible how a single phone call can make 30 years of history feel like it happened just yesterday. We'd love to hear if you have a story of a moment that changed everything for you. Feel free to share it in the comments below. The grief John lived with wasn't sharp anymore. It was a dull, constant pressure, like the low-grade hum of a refrigerator you only notice when it finally clicks off. At 48, he was older than his father had ever been. He sat in his home office, the same small room in the house he grew up in, surrounded by the quiet evidence of a life interrupted. On his desk, next to the monitor, was a framed 5x7 photograph. It was the last picture ever taken of his father. In it, David Miller stood beside 5 other men at a picnic table in the local park, a bright yellow safety vest over his jacket. They were all leaning over a large, unfolded map of their neighborhood, their faces a mixture of concentration and civic duty. Some of the men shielded their eyes from the spring sun, looking towards something outside the frame. That was the Oak Hill Neighborhood Watch, March 1985. A week later, all 6 of them were gone. John had spent his entire adult life circling the black hole they left behind. The official police theory, flimsy as it was, suggested the men had gotten turned around during their patrol and wandered into the dense state forest that bordered their town, succumbing to the elements. Another more painful rumor was that they had simply left, a collective, secret decision to abandon their families and start new lives. John never believed either. His father wasn't a man who ran from anything. The phone rang, cutting through the silence of the afternoon. It was a number he didn't recognize, a local exchange. He answered, expecting a telemarketer. The voice on the other end was gravelly, hesitant. "Is this John Miller, son of David Miller?" "Yes, it is. Who is this?" "My name is Detective Walter. I'm with the Oak Hill Police. I was a rookie back in '85. I remember your father's case." John's grip tightened on the phone. Cops didn't call about 30-year-old cold cases unless something had happened. "Okay," he said, his voice steady. "Look," Walter continued, "I don't want to get your hopes up, but we found something. The city is finally tearing up the old sewer mains under Elm Street. It's a project that's been on the books since the '90s. Budget cuts, you know how it is. They were 2 blocks from the park where your dad's group always met." The hum in John's head stopped. For the first time in 30 years, there was silence. "What did you find?" "A flashlight, an old mag light. It's pretty corroded, but the head was intact. It was lodged in a feeder pipe. We think it's been there a long time." John's eyes flicked to the photo on his desk. His father was the only one in the picture with a big, silver mag light clipped to his belt. He felt a cold dread mixed with a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. A flicker of hope. He met Detective Walter at the station an hour later. Walter was nearing retirement, with kind eyes and the weary posture of a man who had seen too much. He led John into a small, quiet room and placed a clear plastic evidence bag on the table. Inside was the rusted, mud-caked head of a flashlight. It was dented on one side, the glass shattered, but it was undeniably the one. Walter put on a pair of gloves and carefully turned the object over. On the metal base, almost completely obscured by rust and time, were 2 faint, hand-scratched initials. DM. "We found it about 100 yards from the manhole cover on the corner of Elm and Pine," Walter explained softly. "The line it was in runs east, towards the old warehouse district by the river. It was never supposed to be found. That whole section was part of the original pre-war system, cast iron pipes. The city was just going to seal it off, but an engineer insisted on a full replacement, said the ground was too unstable." The lost in the woods theory evaporated in that sterile room. A flashlight doesn't get lost in the woods and end up lodged in a sewer pipe under the very neighborhood his father patrolled. This wasn't an accident. This was a clue. For the first time, John had a thread to pull. He looked at Walter, his mind clear with a new, terrifying purpose. "Can I see the original case file?" he asked. "Everything you have." The file was pathetically thin, a testament to an investigation that had gone nowhere. John sat in the records room for hours, the musty smell of old paper filling his lungs. The witness statements were all the same. The wives saw their husbands leave for patrol around 8 p.m. A teenager remembered seeing them gathered around the picnic table with their map. The last confirmed sighting was from Mrs. Gable, an elderly woman who saw them walking down Elm Street, their flashlights cutting beams through the darkness, around 9:30 p.m. Then nothing. Their cars were still parked at the park the next morning. The map was still on the table, held down by a rock. John's finger traced the lines on a copy of that map. It was a simple grid of their suburb, with certain houses circled in red ink. These were the sites of a recent string of burglaries, mostly small-time stuff, tools from garages, a bicycle off a porch. It was this minor crime wave that had prompted his father to organize the watch in the first place. He called the other wives. Most of the numbers were disconnected, the families long since moved away, trying to outrun the mystery. But he reached one, Patricia, the widow of Charles, the quiet accountant who had served as the group's treasurer. He met her at a small coffee shop the next day. Patricia was in her late 70s now, her hands trembling slightly as she held her cup. Her memory, however, was sharp. "I remember that night," she said, her voice a little shaky. "Charles was anxious. He was never an anxious man. He said they were on to something. He called it the big fish. He said the little break-ins didn't make sense, that it felt like someone was testing the waters, checking response times." John leaned forward. "Did he say anything else? Anything specific?" Patricia thought for a moment, staring out the window. "He mentioned the warehouses down by the river. He said he and David had seen expensive cars down there, late at night. Cars that didn't belong in that part of town. He thought the burglars were using one of the empty buildings to store stolen goods. He told me, 'Don't worry, Trish. We're just going to watch tonight. We're not heroes.'" Those were the last words her husband ever said to her. The warehouses. The district was on the far east side of town, where the sewer line led. It was a collection of decaying brick buildings, long abandoned even in 1985. John took the information back to Walter, who pulled the Old Town plans. The main sewer trunk line from Elm Street ran straight to a discharge point just past the warehouse district. It was a direct, hidden path from the heart of their quiet suburb to the town's forgotten edge. Walter, now invested, started digging on his own time. He pulled the files on the 1985 burglaries and cross-referenced them with officer reports. The name that kept appearing, either as the primary responding officer or the one filing the final report, was Paul. Officer Paul. John vaguely remembered him, a young, confident cop who was always in the local paper for one commendation or another. He was the public face of the department back then. "That's odd," Walter mumbled, tapping a page with his pen. Paul was the one who pushed the lost in the woods theory the hardest. According to these notes, he personally led the first search party into the state forest. He shut down any suggestion that the men might have met with foul play in town. Said it was a waste of resources. John felt a chill crawl up his spine. Why would a cop be so quick to dismiss a possibility? He went home and dug through a dusty box of old photo albums in the attic. After an hour, he found it. A photo from the 1984 town picnic. There was his father, David in his yellow vest, even on his day off, talking to uniformed Officer Paul. They were smiling, but John, looking at it now, saw the tension in his father's shoulders, the forced nature of his smile. They knew each other. And it didn't look friendly. Walter called him later that evening. "John, I ran a check on Paul. He had a stellar career, made detective in record time, retired about 10 years ago with a full pension and a chest full of medals. Lives in a big house over in Northwood. He did very well for himself." It felt too neat, too perfect. A hero cop and 6 missing men. And a flashlight, lying in the dark for 30 years, connecting them all. The investigation was no longer just about finding out what happened. It was about uncovering why it had been hidden. John realized they weren't just looking for a killer. They were looking for a secret that an entire town, and its police force, had been content to leave buried. With Walter's unofficial help, John began to piece together a timeline. The burglary started in January of 1985. The watch group formed in February. The men vanished in March. A week after they disappeared, Officer Paul led a major drug bust at one of the warehouses by the river. It was the biggest bust in the town's history, and it made his career. The story was that he'd been working a long-term undercover case. "Something about that bust has always bothered me," Walter confessed over the phone. "The paperwork was a mess, the evidence manifest. It never fully added up. A lot of cash was reported by the initial team, but the amount that made it to the evidence locker was significantly less. It was chalked up to chaotic scene processing." but it was sloppy. A theory began to form in John's mind. Dark and horrifying. The burglaries weren't the real crime. They were a distraction. The watch group, his father, they weren't looking for a bicycle thief. They were looking for the big fish Patricia had mentioned. What if the big fish wasn't a burglar at all? What if he was a cop? John and Walter decided their next step was a dangerous one. They had no real evidence, just a 30-year-old flashlight and a collection of coincidences. They needed something more. They needed to talk to Paul. They drove to Northwood the next Saturday. Paul's house was a large, modern, colonial setback from the road on a perfectly manicured lawn. Paul himself answered the door. He was in his late 60s, tan and fit, with the same confident smile John remembered from the old newspaper clippings. But his eyes were like chips of ice. "Detective Walter," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "To what do I owe the pleasure? And you must be John Miller. I'd recognize your father's eyes anywhere. Please, come in." His politeness was disarming. He led them to a sunroom overlooking a pristine swimming pool. He offered them drinks. He was in complete control. "I was so sorry to hear about your father back then," Paul said, looking directly at John. "A terrible tragedy. David was a good man, a real pillar of the community." "We're reopening the case," Walter said bluntly, cutting through the pleasantries. Paul's expression didn't change. "After 30 years? May I ask why?" "We found something," John said, his voice quiet but firm. "In a sewer pipe under Elm Street. My father's flashlight." For the briefest of moments, a flicker of something, panic, maybe fear, crossed Paul's face before it was replaced by a look of practiced sympathy. My God, in the sewer? How awful. So it wasn't the woods after all. I guess I was wrong. "You were the one who insisted they were lost in the woods," Walter pressed. "You personally shut down other lines of inquiry." "I was a young officer following the most likely lead," Paul retorted, his voice hardening. 6 men don't just vanish into thin air in a town like this. The woods were the logical explanation. "Another explanation," John said, "is that they found what they were looking for. Patricia, Charles's wife, said they were hunting a big fish. She said they were watching the warehouses." Paul stood up, his relaxed demeanor gone. "The warehouses were my case, a long-term narcotics investigation. If your father and his friends were snooping around there, they were being reckless. They could have compromised a major operation." "Or," Walter said, standing to face him, "they saw something they weren't supposed to see, like a police officer meeting with his criminal associates." "The evidence manifests from your big drug bust," Walter continued, his voice low and steady. "It was short. A lot of money and product never made it into evidence. Money that could set a man up for a very comfortable retirement." Paul's face was pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the back of a chair. "This conversation is over," he snarled. "Get out of my house, both of you. If you come near me again, I'll have you arrested for harassment." They left without another word. The drive back to Oak Hill was silent. They didn't need a confession. Paul's panicked rage was all the confirmation they needed. He was guilty. Now they just had to prove it. Walter knew a direct confrontation was a dead end. Paul was a respected ex-cop who would bury them in legal proceedings. They needed something undeniable, something physical. "He hid them in the sewer, John," Walter said, pulling up to the police station. "I'm sure of it. He used his knowledge as a cop. He knew the city's plans. He knew which sections were obsolete, which pipes were being sealed. He found the perfect place to hide a secret." Walter spent the next 2 days buried in the city planning archives, comparing the 1985 sewer schematics with Paul's patrol logs from that year. He found it, a notation for an emergency main seal at a junction near the warehouse district, dated the day after the watch group disappeared. The reason cited was a structural failure. It was rushed, authorized by a mid-level city manager who was a known associate of Paul's. Armed with this chain of circumstantial evidence, the flashlight, the inconsistent reports, the suspicious timing of the sewer seal, and Paul's volatile reaction, Walter went to a judge. He laid out the entire 30-year-old story, a desperate theory of murder and corruption. It was a long shot, but the judge, intrigued by the enduring local mystery, signed the warrant, not to search Paul's house, but to excavate the sealed sewer junction. The next Monday, a city crew arrived with a backhoe. They tore up the asphalt at the quiet intersection, the air filling with the smell of dirt and diesel. John stood behind the yellow police tape, watching every scoop of earth the machine lifted. He felt numb. This was it. the end of the road. One way or another. He would either find his father or he would have to accept that he might never know. Walter stood beside him, a silent, supportive presence. They dug for 2 days. The crew hit the old brick sewer line and had to switch to hand tools. It was slow, painstaking work. On the afternoon of the third day, a foreman shouted. They had broken through the thick mortar of the 30-year-old seal. The air that escaped the pipe was foul, heavy with the smell of decay and stagnant water. A forensics team, waiting on standby, suited up and descended into the pit. John's heart pounded against his ribs. He watched as, one by one, they brought up 6 large evidence bags. There was no doubt what was inside. After 30 years in the dark, David Miller and the Oak Hill Neighborhood Watch had finally been found. Paul was arrested that evening. Faced with the irrefutable discovery of the bodies, his confident facade crumbled. He confessed everything. The story he told was chillingly simple. The watch group, more capable than he'd ever anticipated, had tracked the burglaries to his operation. That night, his father and the others had followed him to the warehouse and witnessed a drug deal. They were good men, not vigilantes. They confronted him, planning to take their evidence to the police chief, never suspecting that another cop was involved. Paul knew his career, his entire life, was over. In a moment of cold, calculated panic, he and his associates made a decision. There could be no witnesses. They were killed in the warehouse. Using his inside knowledge of the city's maintenance schedule, Paul knew the sewer junction was being permanently sealed the next morning. It was the perfect tomb, a place no one would ever think to look. He personally drove the patrol car that transported the bodies, dumping them into the manhole under the cover of darkness. David's flashlight, knocked from his belt during the struggle, fell in with them, the one tiny mistake in his otherwise perfect crime. A month later, John stood in the bright sunshine of the town cemetery. A memorial had been erected, a simple granite stone engraved with the names of the 6 men: David, Charles, Thomas, George, William, and Michael. They were no longer missing persons. The stone declared them heroes who had died protecting their community. The whole town was there, including the children and grandchildren of the other men. They all shared a common story, a life lived in the shadow of a question mark. The dull hum that had been the background noise of John's entire life was finally gone. In its place was a quiet certainty. It was a terrible truth, a heartbreaking end to a 30-year wait. But it was the truth. He looked at the name carved into the stone, David Miller, and for the first time he wasn't mourning a ghost. He was grieving his father, the brave man in the yellow vest who had simply tried to do the right thing on a dark spring night long ago. The hole in his life would never be filled, but the mystery was over. His father could finally rest, and in a way, so could he. That night in 1985, those men had a choice: to ignore what they saw or to confront it. Do you believe their sense of civic duty was an act of bravery or a tragic misjudgment of the danger they were in? We're always interested to read your perspective on the tough choices people make. If you found yourself captivated by this story, consider subscribing and joining our community. We have many more stories waiting to be told, and we'd be honored to share them with you.